Good afternoon. In the last short lecture, we had left Italy at the end of the Gothic-Byzantine War in the year 553. The last king of the Ostrogoths had fallen in the bloody, desperate battle of Mons Lactarius near Naples against the troops of General Narses. The last Ostrogoths, a handful of survivors of a war that had lasted 18 years, signed a treaty by which they committed to leave Italy. Nothing remained of Italy's Ostrogothic kingdom except for Theodoric's mausoleum in Ravenna and for the fading memory of his wise rule, praised even by the adversaries of the Ostrogoths, like the Byzantine historian Procopius. Procopius was born in Caesarea in Palestine and had taken part in the war. He was the secretary and the advisor of General Belisarius, the commander-in-chief of the Byzantine forces during most of the war. Procopius remained in Italy at least until the conquest of Ravenna in 540. He wrote a history of the three wars of Emperor Justinian: the Persian War, the Vandal War, and the Ostrogothic War. And he also wrote two other interesting books. One of them is called On Buildings, and it is about the monumental public works completed under Justinian. The other one is the famous Secret History, and it is about the scandalous reality behind the scenes of the court of Justinian and his wife Theodora, whom Procopius describes as monster in this last work, to be published after the author's death. Unfortunately, I won't be able to deal with the contradictory personality of Procopius. He wrote in Greek, and he belongs therefore to the history of the Byzantine literature, which is not my subject. However, I can still deal with Procopius' main work, whose subject is largely Italy, the little-known Italy of the 6th century. This work is called The Wars, or About the Wars, Hyper ton polemon logoi in Greek. This book leads us on the steps of the Ostrogothic and Byzantine armies across Italy through countless sieges, battles, fatal military decisions. The book strikes us for the gripping narrative and the wide-ranging interests of the author. He describes a vanished Italy, of which there are no other memories left. Procopius confronts us with the dilemmas of the commanders. He persuades us with their reasonings, exposed in eloquent speeches that he had occasionally witnessed. He carries us right in the middle of battlefields or among terrified or menacing crowds. In his youth, Procopius had studied the classical Greek historians. From Herodotus, he inherited a taste for geographic and ethnographic descriptions. Procopius' descriptions of Italy are functional to his engaging narrative of the war, but they impress us for their precision, and they give us a real idea of the places. The conflict unfolds in a majestic scenario because of the imposing ruins of Italy's ancient cities, and because of the diverse landscapes of the peninsula, with its Apenninic cliffs, its deep forests, its vast marshlands. Italy was already a country of ruins, but still ruins of incomparable grandiosity, towering over the armies and filling the combatants with awe. So the reader remembers the pages describing the stupor of the Byzantine troops approaching Rome on the Appian Way, dominated by giant funerary monuments, or that of Hadrian's mausoleum in Rome, still covered by magnificent statues. Procopius also gives us invaluable information about peoples involved in the war as allies or mercenary troops. The Franks, The Heruli, the Antis, etc., their customs are not more familiar to us than those of the people described by Herodotus 1,000 years before. As Herodotus, Procopius has a taste for narration. He's a rational person, but occasionally he doesn't rule out supernatural influences. A few episodes stand out vividly in the reader's memory. Among them, the fatal malaise of King Theodoric at the sight, in a banquet, of the head of a monstrous fish, which reminds him of the expression distorted by death of Senator Symmachus, unjustly executed for high treason. Or the siege of Naples, full of suspense and dramatic turns of events, or like the spectacular assault of the Ostrogoths to the mausoleum of Hadrian in Rome, or the very famous pages about the famine in Italy. Procopius is a great writer. He is clear, technical, and precise on military actions. And he is remarkably objective in his account. He doesn't try to minimize the mistakes and the setbacks of the Byzantines, and he acknowledges the heroism of the Ostrogoths and their magnanimity in many occasions, especially that of Totila, the best commander of the Ostrogoths, who managed to reverse the nearly desperate situation of his people after the loss of Ravenna. The wars are therefore a masterwork of historiography and a unique account of 6th century Italy. Let's now go back where we left off. After the end of the war in 553, Italy was ruled until 567 by General Narses, who had defeated the Ostrogoths. Already in the year 554, Justinian's pragmatic sanction for Italy was promulgated. Pragmatic sanctions were emperor's decrees on certain important matters having the force of fundamental laws. In the case of Justinian, they coincided with the laws because Justinian had concentrated the legislative power in his person. At this point, we can't avoid, however, to outline the legislative work of Justinian, which was part of a broader design, which we need to mention now. The figure of Justinian dominates the 6th century in the whole Mediterranean area. When Justinian undertook his war for the conquest of Italy, he had already ruled as emperor for 8 years, and in the years preceding that period, he had had the opportunity to assist with important responsibility Emperor Justin, who had obtained the throne by chance circumstances in 518, when he was already 68 years old. Justin was an Illyrian general who was illiterate and relied on his promising nephew, to whom he secured the best possible education. It was an excellent investment. The name of this nephew was Flavius Petrus Sabatius Justinianus. He was born, like his uncle, in a peripheral area of the empire, in the small town of Tauresium, in what is now the Republic of Macedonia. He became the right hand of his elderly uncle and assumed more and more responsibilities until he ended up managing de facto the empire. When in the year 527 Justin died, Justinian ascended to the throne, and then he ruled until the year 565, i.e. for almost 40 years, plus his long apprenticeship period in which he had to learn all the secrets of his future job. This uncommon continuity, together with Justinian intelligence, operosity, and versatility, allow him to pursue an incredibly ambitious project to restore the Roman Empire in its political and religious unit and in its former territories, wiping the slate clean after centuries of barbarian invasion and Christologic controversies. Such a project required a strengthening of the emperor's power. And in fact, a few years after the start of his rules, Justinian confronted the issue of the power of the political factions, represented by two associations of supporters, the Greens and the Blues, named after the colors of the chariot teams who raced in Constantinople's hippodrome. Over the years, these two factions had evolved into political organizations which formed the city militia and took part in certain public works like the reinforcement and the maintenance of the city walls. The Blue faction was headed by Greek-Roman senatorial landholding aristocracy, whilst the Green faction represented mainly the commercial and industrial middle classes, frequently of Eastern origins. The Blues were Orthodox Christians, the Greens were Monophysites, or supporters of other non-Orthodox current of Christians. Those factions had acquired a large political influence. They partly financed themselves by racketeering. They defiantly wore outlandish costumes and hairstyles and clashed with each other like modern gangs or rowdy bikers. The reign of Anastasius, Justine's predecessor, had been marked by public riots in 532. After a capital sentence on rowdies, both factions turned against Justinian against the so-called Nika Riot after the cry "win" that the crowd used to incite the racing teams. The memory of the previous riots paled in comparison to this tumult. The faction hoarders came to the point of proclaiming a nephew of Anastasius as new emperor in the capital's hippodrome, after setting fire to the church of the Holy Wisdom, Hagia Sophia, and to other major buildings. After 6 days of rebellion, Justinian was prepared to embark and flee into exile, but he was dissuaded by Empress Theodora during a dramatic meeting. The decision to resist proved to be a good one. The troops of General Belisarius, who were back from the war with the Persian, managed to enter the hippodrome in full combat gear and started to slay the crowd packed inside it. Panic followed. According to Procopius, over 30,000 people were killed on that day. But after this crackdown, still the restoration design of Justinian looked like overambitious. It was based on an image of the empire no longer corresponding to reality. The subject of the empire still called themselves Romans and will continue to do so for another 1,000 years, but in fact, for the last 2 centuries, they had been living under the nightmare of the barbarian invasions, which the emperors had narrowly escaped by diverting the barbarians toward the west. The belief of the Byzantines that the barbarian kings of Italy had been exercising their power in the name of the emperor was a delusion. In addition, the religious leadership of the emperor had been weakened by the consolidated divisions in the Christian community. Arians, Nestorians, Monophysites, etc. Those schismatic creeds had been joined by entire peoples, by key provinces of the empire like Egypt and Syria, and by a few emperors. For instance, Emperor Anastasius, Justine's predecessor, had been a Monophysite. Nevertheless, Justinian set about to restore the religious unity of the empire. As we have seen during the last lecture, Emperor Justine had already started a defense of the Christian orthodoxy, i.e. of the Christian doctrine that had been shaped by the Great Ecumenic Councils of the last 2 centuries, that of Nicaea of 325, which had condemned the doctrines of Iuris, that of Ephesus of 431, that had condemned the Nestorians, and that of Chalcedonia of 451, in which the church had prevailed on monophysism. Justinian continued to defend Christian orthodoxy, but he wasn't simply supporting the Roman Church. He saw himself as the supreme authority of the Christian ecumeny and regarded the Pope and the patriarchs as his subordinates. He erected monumental churches like the new church of Hagia Sophia on the place of the one destroyed during the Nika Riot. This extraordinary building remained for 1,000 years the symbol of the Christianity of the empire. He also wrote treatises and got directly involved in the organization of the clergy and in the administration of monasteries. Oriental monasticism received a formidable impulse from Justinian. New monasteries surged everywhere. We know, for instance, that in the year 536, there were in Constantinople no less than 67 monasteries for monks, plus an unspecified number of nunneries. Near to those monasteries, also orphanages were founded, as well as homes for elderly and poor people, which added prestige to the church. It was a costly policy. The multiplication of monasteries and the extension of the lands controlled by them, normally exempted from taxation, increased the fiscal burden on the remaining population, whilst the large number of novices impacted on the recruitment capacity of the army, almost constantly at war from Persia to the Atlantic Ocean. Justinian repressed the heresies and persecuted even Jews and pagans. The power of the church was for him a means to establish the empire's supremacy on the Mediterranean, no less than the armies of Narses and Belisarius. To the pagans he forbade teaching, and in 529 he closed the academy in Athens, founded by Plato 1,000 years before, forcing the scholars to seek refuge by the enemy, the Sasanian Emperor Chosroes I. Only with the Monophysites, supported also by Empress Theodora, Justinian tried to reach some sort of compromise, although this was insufficient to gain him popularity in the eastern provinces, in which the movement was particularly strong. But apart from concentrating in his person the political and religious power, Justinian laid the legal foundation of such power. As he became emperor, he ordered the reorganization, under the supervision of the Juris Tribunian, of the entire legislative production of the Roman Empire during the previous 5 centuries. The result of this colossal work was the Corpus Iuris Civilis, i.e., the body of the civil law. Justinian Corpus consisted of 4 works: the actual Codex, a collection of the statutes issued by the Roman emperors from Hadrian to Justinian himself, the digester or pandectes, meaning all covering. The digest contained abstract from the responsa, i.e. the opinion given and the decision taken by the most eminent legal experts in the history of Rome. Those abstracts had been taken from over 2,000 works, checked for consistency and organized by topics. The Institutiones, a textbook for students of law, which examined the institution of Roman law, and finally the Novelle Constitutionem, i.e. the laws issued by Justinian after the publication of his Codex. Those 4 works had the force of law and replaced completely the previous laws, so that even making reference to original sources from which the various abstracts had been taken was no longer admitted. Justinian also included the religious legislation in his collection, i.e. the decrees of the popes, but not all of them, only those which sanctioned decisions of the holy synods called by an emperor. Thereby, Justinian's corpus implicitly made the emperor the supreme source of religious legislation. With our understanding of legislative work of Justinian, now we can go back to Italy in 554. The pragmatic sanction was enacted, formally upon request of Pope Vigil, by then subdued the Byzantines, and the pragmatic sanction regulated a few civil law issues. It established weight and measures. It submitted the clergy to a religious tribunal and attributed to the bishops certain administrative competencies that had once belonged to the ancient curia, so that the bishops became a public official as well, and thereby ultimately subject to the emperor. This concentration of secular and religious authorities into the hands of a single person led to the creation of the word Caesar of Papism to describe Justinian's rulership. This centralization might not appeal to us, but it shouldn't deter from focusing on the immense value of Justinian codification work. His influence in Italy was not immediately apparent because of the invasion of the Langobards. But when, several centuries later, Italy re-emerged from barbarity, Justinian Corpus amazed those that had become used to judicial combats, to ordeals, and to the Germanic consuetudinary right. The Corpus Iuris Civilis reaccustomed the magistrates to caution in judgment, to humane punishment, to a debate in front of the courts, and to verdicts based on the reasoning of the judge instead of on his simple acknowledgement of the means by which God was presumed to have taken a side pro or against the defendant. The most important part of the corpus for the influence it had during the Middle Ages and beyond was by far the digest. When it was rediscovered in the 12th century, it brought back to Europe a knowledge that had been forgotten, and together with the memory that this knowledge had once existed. Of course, the philologic punctiliousness of the compilers had been limited by their need to produce a body of laws by which the magistrate could decide in a consistent way and in accordance with the conditions of their times and with the influence of a new religion. But the achievement of this consistency is precisely one of the strengths of this work, whose value remains incomparably above that of the other three codifications of the late Roman antiquity, the Codex Gregorianus, the Codex Hermogenianus, and the Codex Theodosianus. During the Middle Ages, the digest will remain the unattainable model of juridical wisdom in Europe, an almost mythical book, containing the summa of the legal doctrine of the antiquity. This analytical and legislative masterwork had also linguistic consequences on the medieval civilization. The language of the corpus was Latin, apart from the novellae, which were mostly in Greek. This fact contributed to the persistent hegemony of Latin for many centuries, not to mention its still ample presence in the modern legal terminologies of many countries. And yet, Justinian was the last emperor to use Latin as first language. In any case, his troop and his official normally spoke Greek, although Latin was also used for military commands. But the Greek of the Byzantines didn't really stick to Italy, not even in Ravenna, where the Byzantines remained for other 2 centuries. Latin remained the language of knowledge and of law in Europe. We have said that in Italy the value of Justinian codification was discovered late, and that caused during the 12th century a rediscovery of Roman law. But what the population of Italy discovered almost immediately was the oppressive, merciless taxation of the Byzantines. Justinian's officials showed immediately a sinister creativity in devising new methods of exaction. For instance, some Byzantine officials accused the Latin population of having evaded tributes due to Theodorics decades before, and demanded retroactively large sums. We have seen in previous lectures how the war, the famines, and the epidemics had depopulated Italy's rural areas. The survivors led a gloomy existence among deserted fields, but the Byzantines demanded from them also the payment of the taxes for their neighbors who had fled or had been murdered many years before. Furthermore, the Byzantines administration imposed ruinous sales to their troops at set prices and unpaid work for the state. They even had the audacity of requiring large sums of money for the transportation costs to Constantinople of requisitioned items, commodities. There was no escape from such rapacity. The exactions were carried out also by attributing a sort of joint and several tax liability to entire communities, so that whole villages were occasionally surrounded and starved until the tributes due by some people were eventually cashed out by the village. In Sardinia, these savage methods reached the effect, according to the reliable evidence provided by the correspondence of Pope Gregory I, always careful and responsible in his protest, consequence to force people to sell their own children into slavery in order to pay taxes. Justinian's grandiose projects to restore the ancient Roman Empire had been, in fact, paid very dearly. The wars conducted across 3 continents, the public works completed in record times with huge manpower, the generous support to the church and to hundreds of monasteries, all that had in fact dragged the empire into an economic and financial crisis. That crisis had been also exacerbated by the pandemic known as the Justinianic Plague, which had desolated vast areas in many provinces. But apart from that, the empire had simply become overstretched, overextended, and the military expenditure had become unsustainable. This was the reason for the fiscal oppression, aggravated by the corruption endemic among Byzantine officials and military commanders. The rapacity of those commanders didn't spare the Byzantine troops and their allies, and triggered occasional mass desertions and rebellions. So, under the appearance of restoration of the Roman Empire, a major financial crisis was undermining Justinian's state. When Justinian the Great died in the year 565, the metastasis reflected in Procopius' disillusioned secret history revealed itself in the very rapid loss of the many western territories that had been conquered at a terrible price. The same pattern of overextension and soaring military expenses, followed by a sudden, unexpected crisis, will occur to many other empires in history, including the recent cases of the British Empire and the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Byzantine in Italy was very quick. In 567, General Narses went back to Constantinople. Less than 2 years later, the hurricane of the Langobards' invasion fell over Italy. The Byzantines could not contain it. The Langobards occupied very quickly most of the Italian peninsula, as we have anticipated in the first lecture of this cycle. The Byzantines could retain only a few enclaves like Ravenna, Pesaro, or Rome for a while, and a few areas in the south of Italy. Those areas were controlled by military commanders reporting to an exarch, a sort of governor for provinces too far from the core of the empire. Those enclaves were connected by a chain of 45 military presidia called castra. The word castrum is still at the basis of many Italian toponyms, which the Byzantine army managed to defend with its immense experience and superior technical skill. the Exarchate in Italy would last for other 2 centuries until it gave in to the Langobards in the 8th century. Shortly before, also the Langobards disappeared from the Italian history. The Langobards or Lombards are mentioned already in the last book of Procopius Wars as the most savage and brutal of all their many barbarian allies, the only ones who didn't hesitate to violate temples, to kidnap and rape the women of the Ostrogoths and Latin alike. The first act of Narses after he had won the war in the final battle with the Ostrogoths had been to make sure that their Langobard allies left immediately Italy. And indeed, when the Langobards returned in 569, their attitude was different from that of the Ostrogoths. For the Langobards, Italy was just a place to plunder, and the Latins only slaves and hostages. But as their movement to the west was contained by the Frankish kingdoms, the Langobards eventually settled in Italy. This time, the lights would be put out for 200 years in the Italian peninsula. The Byzantine domain crumbled also in Spain under the pressure of the Visigoths. All the reconquered western provinces of Justinian empires were lost again, forever. What had looked like a new dawn for a restored Roman Empire had turned out to be the last ray of a sunset. After Justinian, the Byzantine emperors will focus on the east, where wars restarted with the Persian and would eventually evolve in a giant conflict between empires. Furthermore, nearly 10 years later, a completely new threat appeared for the Eastern Empire, the threat of the Islamic expansion. In the next lecture, we will take a closer look at Italy under the Langobards or the Lombards. Have a nice evening and see you soon.